Hello, and welcome to today's presentation, Trauma and Poverty in the African American Community. This presentation is brought to you by God's Way Christian Baptist Church, where our pastor is the Honorable Reverend Dr. B.R. Reese. It is sponsored through our Wellness and Empowerment Community Ministries, whose goal is to empower and to educate the African American community around the issues of mental illness. I first want to discuss the concept of trauma. Take a moment, if you will, to look at this picture. Try to imagine the emotions the woman is experiencing. With her hands on her knees, I could say that she is worried. I could say that she's experiencing grief. I could say that she's overwhelmed by her current circumstances. How did this match your definition of trauma? So when I discuss trauma, I mean an intense and overwhelming experience involving serious loss, threat, or harm to a person's physical or emotional well being. Trauma may occur at any point in a person's life. A person may experience a single traumatic event or multiple traumatic events occurring over a period of time. When one experiences trauma, they often overwhelm their coping resources. This often leads to dangerous ways of coping that, in the short term, provide some relief, but in the long term can be quite hazardous to that individual and those around them. There are three types of trauma, but for this presentation, we will discuss it for two types, that being big T and little t. So a big type of trauma would be, as pictured, Hurricane Katrina. It could be a tornado. It could even be, in these days, a pandemic. In thinking about little trauma, it's the type of trauma that, for those on the outside, may seem insignificant, but for the person experiencing the trauma, it's very significant. I think most of us can empathize with a debt crisis, um, falling short at the end of the month and being worried about paying rent. It could be a breakup. It could be some turmoil within the family, possibly with your children, that is a little trauma. While little traumas involve day to day events happening in the lives of individuals struggling with poverty, such as trying to feed themselves and their children, or having a place that's safe and warm to stay at night. In contrast, big T's can also involve the death of a parent, which I think most of us would acknowledge as a big trauma. Now let's talk for a moment about poverty. I think it's difficult for the average individual to associate themselves as being impoverished. When the average American thinks of poverty, they think of children in Africa dying from famine and not having enough to eat due to a grain shortage. They don't consider that there are people living in poverty here in the United States. Certainly, because it is one of the most richest countries in the world, we don't associate poverty with our country. What people are more apt to state about the millions in the United States living in poverty is that they are poor. So who's poor in the United States? Almost 1 out of 16 people in the United States are living in deep poverty. Census records show that as of 2012, 6.6, as many as 20.4 million people are living in deep poverty. And the most vulnerable are ethnic and racial minorities, women and children, and families headed by single women. Blacks and Hispanics are more likely than whites to be poor and to be in poverty, and certainly live in deep poverty. The nexus of trauma and poverty is important to understand. It's important to understand the effects of trauma and poverty on our family members, on the relationships that those members have with the rest of the community, and their responses to trauma is critical to improving their outcome. Trauma creates a stress response in the brain. And under stress, an individual cannot respond properly to a crisis, cannot learn what needs to happen to remedy their situation, and of course is not able to process what is actively happening in trauma. And the brain, for its part, is never given a time to be calm and at peace, such that it can return to a higher functioning to respond and process trauma. The effect of trauma related to poverty on the brain is significant. It hurts our abilities to make decisions about school, finances, and life. It imposes a mental burden close to that of losing 13 IQ points. Poverty in and of itself is humiliating and can be another source of strain in trying to function properly. Experiencing multiple traumas related to poverty can put an individual at risk for a number of mental health issues, such as anxiety, physical health problems, sleep problems, emotional problems, memory problems, and flashbacks. If we were to look at trauma in poverty over the span of someone's life, say we start with a young person growing up in poverty and experiencing that trauma can affect and change their brains. Those changes in their brains can impair how they interact socially with other family members in the community. It can impair the way they experience emotions and certainly how they behave as a result of those emotions. It can even affect their cognitive abilities and how they're able to manage crisis as adults. I stated in the beginning that there were some negative coping mechanisms, so I'll repeat that now. Eating disorders, smoking, and substance abuse stem from an individual's attempt to cope with the trauma that they're experiencing. And certainly, severe and persistent behavioral and health problems are possible for those experiencing the trauma of poverty. This slide shows Maslow's hierarchy of needs. We see at the bottom that our first need is for food, water, and shelter. And once we reach those needs and fulfill them, we move on to security, safety, and health. And when those needs are met, we move on to love and belonging, community, family. And when those needs are met, we can move to self-esteem, self-respect, personal strength. And then finally, we move to becoming who we were meant to be. For the individual in poverty, a great deal of energy is used in trying to provide for the first two levels of the pyramid. The trauma involved in providing for these basic needs inhibits an individual's ability to achieve self-actualization. The solution to the trauma caused by poverty must be multifaceted. As much as I or anyone else would love to give every individual $1 million, that will not quite cure the ills of trauma experienced in poverty. The building blocks for success in trying to recover and live to the best of our ability despite circumstances is linked to three things: attachment, feeling connected, loved, and valued, part of a family. And we can do that through building community. The second is regulation. As individuals, we do need to learn about our emotions and how to express them in a healthy way, and how to resolve conflict in a healthy way. The third is competence. It is acting to the benefit of the community instead of acting to the benefit of the desires of oneself. Accepting oneself and making good choices for yourself and the community. I hope you will stay tuned to the second installation of this series, where we can speak more in depth about the intergenerational trauma of poverty, as well as racism, because that too plays a part. And I invite you to share this with whomever and become a part of the conversation. Thank you. My name is Nicole Trefan. Hello, and welcome to today's presentation, Trauma and Poverty in the African American Community. This presentation is brought to you by God's Way Christian Baptist Church, where our pastor is the Honorable Reverend Dr. B.R. Reese. It is sponsored through our Wellness and Empowerment Community Ministries, whose goal is to empower and to educate the African American community around the issues of mental illness.